Sun ruined. 1. Sunlight. The California sunlight pouring in through the windows seemed meaningless. Paul Ward listened to the voice squawking on the other end of the phone. The voice belonged to his sister, Dory, and it struggled to sound sympathetic, but it came out all wrong because sympathy did not suit its owner. When Dory stopped talking, Paul hung up the phone, not fully aware of everything she had said. He found a chair and sat down, his legs weak. His father had died, 3 months after his mother. The official diagnosis had been inoperable cancer, but Paul figured it could just as well have been loneliness and sorrow. Tomorrow, he would have to catch a plane to Ohio. He sat in the chair, sunlight all around him, his hopelessness struggling to drink it up and turn it black. 2. Dory. Early spring outside. Cold, but not the bitter Ohio winter cold. After the funeral, Paul followed Dory back to their childhood home on Birch Street. Now they stood in the living room that nobody lived in anymore. The house was completely empty. Paul hadn't seen Dory since his mother's funeral. Even though that was only 3 months ago, she looked like she had aged 10 years. Always a severe tight-faced woman, her hair had gone even grayer, and the circles under her intense, probing eyes were even darker. She passed him a manila envelope. It wasn't until she used her left hand, drawing his attention to it, that he was reminded of the fact she only had 3 fingers. Her pinky and ring fingers were missing and she had a burn scar extending halfway up to her elbow. He couldn't remember exactly what had happened. Some kind of accident. He was only about 4 or 5 at the time. Dory was 10 years older than him. "There is the will and the check for half of the auction earnings," she said, her voice robotic, harsh. "You sold everything, didn't you?" He had been in the hospital for the last 2 months. The doctors knew he wouldn't be coming home. "Stop pretending you would have been interested in any of it. It was just an observation. I never could figure out why you hated them so much." "I never hated them. I just had a separate life to live. That's all." Outside, the rain spattered against the windows. "Selling the house?" he asked. "Yes. You'll get half." Then he asked a question he had never asked before, even though he had always wondered what the answer would be. He pointed to the small bedroom in the back of the house and said, "Why didn't anyone ever use that room? Mother never told you? She wasn't as close to me as she was to you. That was going to be the nursery for their firstborn. He never made it home from the hospital and they just left it empty as a sort of memorial. Did you ever think Mom and Dad were a little bit odd?" "I'm not getting into this with you, Paul. Let them rest. You can stop slandering them now. Have a good time in California." And then she turned and left, heading out into the tempestuous weather. 3. A memory. Paul had looked into the room before, but he couldn't remember ever being in the room, and he only really remembered looking into it the one time. He had been 7. Just old enough to have some really vivid, terrifying nightmares he always remembered in their entirety. After one of these nightmares, in the middle of the night, he got out of bed and went to his parents' room. They were not in their bed. He thought this was strange because they always went to bed at the same time as the children. Once they said it was bedtime, then the only sound in the house came from Dory's radio inanely spewing out top 40 hits. Thinking about Dory listening to that kind of stuff now made him smile a little bit on the inside, imagining something within her being soothed by all that was common and shallow. He had wandered through the darkened house, gently calling for his parents. They were not in any room. That left only the empty room to be searched. He had no idea why the room remained empty. He hadn't really thought about it. He just kind of assumed their family didn't really need the extra space. Nevertheless, the room had always given him the creeps and he was afraid to go all the way in. He approached the room and cracked the door. He looked in. He did not see his parents in the room. He could hardly see anything. The room was too bright. He didn't know why his parents would leave the lights on in an empty room all night, especially since his father, with stringent frugality, faithfully turned off every light in the house when they went to bed. He closed the door and went back upstairs to his parents' bedroom, still having no idea where they were. He was a little bit frightened but not terrified because he didn't think anything that bad could ever really happen to his parents. He crawled into their bed, waiting for them, thinking of where they might be. Maybe just to a neighbor's. Maybe they were in the basement for some reason or the other. That was probably it. He hadn't checked the basement. Or maybe they had been in that awful empty room and he just hadn't seen them because it was too bright. It had to be something like that. Paul had fallen asleep before his parents came to bed. Upon waking he found himself in his own bed and knew it was his parents who put him there. 4. The empty room. Now it was the middle of the night many years later and Paul left his hotel on Main Street, getting in his car to drive back to his parents' house and not having the slightest idea as to why he was doing this. Thick black clouds obliterated the moon and he kept the heat cranked up in his car, driving through the streets of the town and remembering why he hated his parents so much. Most people would have said it was because they had put him in rehab when he was 17 for what they had seen as alcoholism and what he had seen as being a teenager. True, this had wiped out his last year of high school and stigmatized him beyond belief, but he didn't think that was the reason he hated them. And he did hate them. He had lied to Dory earlier. But he thought it was for a completely different reason than forced rehab. He hated them because he never really felt loved. It was that simple. Maybe it was juvenile. Maybe it was self-pity. Maybe it was even untrue. But he didn't think so. His parents had always seemed preoccupied. Like there was something more immediate and more important than he and Dory. He had always been a sensitive person. He felt things. He felt things when they were there and he felt the absence of things when they were not there. Reaching the house, he had no problem gaining admittance. He still had the key on his keychain from his teenage years. He opened the door and walked into the empty house, the ghosts of distant years pressing down on his shoulders. He didn't bother shutting the front door all the way. He didn't think he would be there very long. He wasn't even sure exactly why he had come. Only he was. He was sure. He was going to look in the empty room. He was going to look in there just to convince himself it was a normal room, just like every other room. And then he was going to leave. He was going to leave feeling like some grand secret had been lifted from his brain, and then he was going to catch the first plane back to California and put this whole godforsaken past behind him. It was ridiculous, he knew, but his heart quickened as he reached the door to the empty room. This was not a big deal. This was not as traumatic as losing his parents should have been, but he felt a greater surge of emotion as he clutched the cool doorknob in his hand. Sure, open up the door, see the darkened empty room, erase every childhood fear he had about this room and then go back home to begin forgetting and forgiving because, really, he thought those things would have to be synonymous to him. Forgiving. Forgetting. When all was forgotten, all would be forgiven. He turned the knob and swung the door inward. Light stung his eyes. His heart hammered in his chest as he tried to discern the source of all that fantastic light. It came from the window. Sunlight. And now that he stood there in the room, it didn't seem that bright at all. Just odd. For sunlight to be pouring in through a window after midnight. That had to be impossible. Impossible, yes, but it felt kind of nice. Very nice. Exquisite. Yes. That was how he thought of it. Exquisite. He stood there in the sunlight pouring in through the window. The same sunlight that had poured in through the same window for many, many years, and he saw it radiate off his skin, sneak in through his skin, lifting his mood, lightening his memories, erasing sadness. The sunlight had meaning again. A burst of meaning, shooting through him, creating a curious revelatory sensation that made him feel like he could create or destroy anything he wanted to. And then he was gone. No longer standing in the empty room. 5. The land of laughing children. And no longer looking at the exquisite sunlight. The sunlight was gone entirely, replaced with illumination that was somehow more eerie. It was like the wan light afforded by an eclipse, or perhaps that found on a clear night with a full moon. He didn't know exactly what he was looking at. In front of him, towering over him, was a mansion. It was a prototypical mansion, very Italianate and symmetrical, with 8 white plaster columns supporting a second-story balcony. He had no desire to go into the mansion. For some reason, he knew what he would find in there. A lot of old furniture covered with sheets. Dusty mirrors that turned every image spectral. To his left dripped a huge weeping willow tree. To his right, a gnarled live oak twisted out its branches, nearly parallel with the ground. Farther off to his left was either the ocean or a lake. Whatever it was, it did not wave or even lap at the shore, and it seemed to loom with its deep cobalt blue depth slightly above the ground he stood on, threatening to wash over him and consume him and everything in his surroundings at any moment. Yet, the feeling he had felt back in the empty room remained. He felt like he walked in some kind of revelatory vision, one that he seemed entirely cognizant of at the time, like when you're having a dream and you know that you are dreaming and you do not want the dream to end. From somewhere, behind the house possibly, he heard the sound of children laughing. A boy popped out from underneath the willow tree. Paul quickly took him in. The first thing he thought was that the boy looked Amish. His brown hair was cropped in a strange fashion and he wore heavy black clothes over a dirty white shirt. Then Paul noticed the boy's bare feet. They seemed too large and the nails were long. "Can't catch me," the boy said, and took off running to the right of the mansion. Paul thought he could catch him. He took off running after the boy, suddenly aware of the cool soft grass on his feet that were also bare. He chased the boy around the house and came to a stop. There were other boys there. And they all looked just like this first one. Paul started to count and stopped when he got to 10. There were more than that. Paul's good feeling went away. He didn't know exactly why, except that something just didn't seem right anymore. Something didn't seem right and it didn't seem good. "Wanna play ball?" a boy at the front of the pack said. "I don't think I do," Paul said, already backing away. Maybe if he could just get to the front of the mansion, then he could find that beam of perfect light and go back into the empty room, because even that place, and all of its silent, inherent scariness, was better than this place. "I think you do," the boy said, and hurled something that was not a ball at Paul's head. The rock struck him above the right eye and consciousness swam around him, a grim nausea tickling the back of his brain. He turned to run. Another rock caught him in the back of his head and sent him to the ground. The children were upon him and he kicked, trying to scoot along on the grass, trying to get away, finding it absurd that he was being beaten by a group of children. Quickly, they bound his arms and his legs with a thick rope. Then they hoisted him up and carried him. Paul screamed. It was the first time in his life he had ever screamed. Looking up at the black moonless sky, he screamed and screamed. The sound of his voice felt like the only power he had. The boys put him down on a wooden slab. It was a table of sorts. A fire crackled somewhere beside him, but the boys wouldn't let him turn his bloodied head. Instead, they held it straight, so that he stared forward. Sitting at the head of the table, looking at him with only a vague sense of familiarity, were his mother and father. Suddenly, things made sense to him. They made sense, and he put things together in his head, but he couldn't blurt them out fast enough. No. His parents had never loved him. And he thought he knew what had taken Dory's fingers. Thought he knew how she had come about the burns. And he thought he knew why she was able to love their parents and he was not. She had understood. She understood about the firstborn. About the firstborn being the only real child his parents had ever wanted, and when that firstborn child had died, a part of his parents had died too because they realized something about mortality, and then maybe somehow they found this place that allowed them to escape mortality, and, feeling the boy's hands on his body, Paul knew they had come here again and again. Here, to this place where the first child would always live. Where he would always be born into perfection. Again and again. These were the children his parents had loved. And why not? Paul thought. They would never get old. They would grow to whatever age his parents wanted them to grow to, and then they would stop, and they would never die. They would never hate. They would only love. Unconditionally. Regardless of what the parents wanted them to do. Paul started to say something to his parents, sitting there with their cold eyes measuring him, but he was yanked up by the throat and carried over to the crackling fire. Dory had got out. Somehow, she had escaped this fate. But Dory had always been the strong one, and, as the first of the flames licked his bare feet, Paul knew he would never feel the sunlight again. Next story. Lights out. Jody swore under her breath as she balled her frozen hands into fists and pushed them under her arms, trying to warm them. Her fingers felt like ice that could snap off at any moment. Beside her, Earl lit a cigarette and puffed on it until the smolder took hold. His eyes were bloodshot under swollen lids, and deep crevices around the corners of his mouth told Jody he was working off a hangover. On her other side, Miho huddled against the loading dock's brickwork, bundled up in layers of coats and scarves. Her nose was red, barely visible above the fur lining of the jacket she'd pulled up around her ears, and she kept sniffing and rubbing at it with the back of her knitted glove. Jody pulled one hand out and checked her watch. It was 10 past. She swore again. "I say we go back inside and let them bring them in themselves," Earl said. "Your dad would have our necks," Jody retorted. The words came out more harshly than she'd meant them to, but Earl didn't seem to notice. "I've already told him I'm not working here anymore." He exhaled a cloud of smoke in a slow stream. "I'm a damn laughing stock, working in a girl's clothing store." Jody bit her tongue. The cold was making her want to bicker, but she knew better than to upset the boss's son. Besides, he wasn't going anywhere. He hadn't been able to hold down any other job, and though he said he hated the supposed degradation of being surrounded by fashion, he enjoyed partying too much to give up his only source of income. "It's here," Miho said with evident relief. She pushed off the wall and started hopping from foot to foot, trying to get some warmth into her legs as she watched the truck backing into the loading dock. Its flashing lights and an intermittent beep warned of its arrival. Earl squinted, his eyes closed as though that could block out the sound. Jody waited until the truck came to a stop, its rear roller doors facing them, then shuffled towards the cabin. A wave of heat swept over her face as the driver rolled down the window and gave her a toothy grin. "Enjoying the weather?" he asked, passing the clipboard out for her to sign. "Yeah, it's a gorgeous spring day, huh?" Jody said, forcing a smile. Outside, the loading dock's doors was obscured by sheets of heavy rain that blurred the outlines of the trees just beyond the parking lot. "You got it from here?" The driver took the clipboard back. Jody noticed a well-worn novel on the passenger seat and a refillable mug filled with some steaming substance in the cup holder. "Yeah, we'll be right." She, Earl, and Miho were already freezing and miserable. There was no point dragging the driver out to help them when he so clearly wanted to enjoy his break in the truck's warm cabin. Jody shuffled to the back of the truck again, where Earl had already pulled up the roller doors. Miho stood by with the trolley as Jody climbed into the back of the truck. She found 8 wooden crates strapped to the truck's floor. As she started to unbuckle them, a chilled sensation that had nothing to do with the cold crawled down Jody's back. She sometimes got the feeling late at night, when her apartment suddenly seemed wildly too big and too empty for her, and she would pause the TV to listen, convinced she'd heard a door open, and imagined she heard footsteps, foreign and heavy, creeping across the scratched wooden floors. The sensation was so strong that she stopped, one hand holding the strap's buckle. Her other hand rested on the lid of the crate, which was long, narrow, and large enough for a person to fit inside. Like a crude coffin. Jody dropped the buckle and stepped back, the sensation growing stronger, digging its claws into her chest and gnawing at her stomach. She imagined opening one of the wooden boxes, pushing aside the packing material to find a face, blanched white from death, eyes stitched closed, hands clasped over its suited chest, waiting for her. "What's the matter?" Earl slurred around his cigarette. His small eyes were scowling at her as he stood over his own crate. The sound of his voice snapped Jody back to reality. She took a deep breath and shook her head. "Nothing. Nothing at all. Let's hurry and get out of this damned cold." They managed to squeeze 4 crates onto the trolley, stacking them on top of each other. Earl and Miho stood on either side, bracing the wooden boxes, while Jody pulled the handle, guiding their cargo through the concrete back passageways of the shopping center. Their store was in the eastern end of the Inglebrook Center. The complex was nearly 2 decades old, but scrupulous cleaning and frequent renovations kept it looking brand new. The public enjoyed polished tile floors, natural lighting via the glass ceiling, and frequent clusters of potted palm trees and shrubs that were so shiny they looked fake upon first glance. Jody got to see a very different part of the center, though, the back passageways used by the cleaners and store staff to carry equipment through the building without disturbing the carefully cultivated atmosphere of the public section. There were no polished tile floors in the back passageways, no potted plants, and no air conditioning. The back held only concrete, which showed its age with discolored patches and stains, and weak fluorescent lights that cast a sickly glow over the tunnels. Jody felt like a maid in a historical novel, condemned to use the servants' passageways to travel through her wealthy lord's manor. "Can you go any faster?" Earl barked. "I'm freezing back here." "They're ceramic," Jody retorted, "and I'm not about to explain to the boss that we dropped and broke them." Earl muttered something under his breath, but Jody ignored him. They were almost at the door that opened into their shop's cramped storage room. It would be warmer there, and brighter. "Careful!" Miho shrieked, and Earl shouted a series of expletives. Jody turned to see that the top crate had shifted, slipping off its pile, and Earl was struggling to get it back on. "What did I just say?" Jody snapped, hurrying to help him. For the second time that morning, her words came out harsher than she'd intended, and Earl noticed. He gave the crate a final, hard shove to get it back into place, then turned on Jody, his bloodshot eyes furious. "It wasn't my fault. Miho pushed it." "I didn't," the girl squeaked from behind the crates. "I was just holding it, and it started falling towards you." "Liar," he yelled back, his voice cracking. "You shoved it really damn hard. You were trying to get me into trouble." "Enough." Jody pressed her numb fingers to the bridge of her nose, where a headache had started. "I don't care what happened. It didn't fall, it didn't break, and Mr. Heinlein has nothing to yell at us about. That's the main thing." Earl didn't look happy, but he wisely kept his mouth shut. Jody wrenched their storage room door open and carefully guided the trolley inside. The small area was stuffed with far too much stock. Shelves on one wall held bags full of laybys, and racks were crowded with shirts and dresses that hadn't fit into the front store or were damaged and waiting to be returned. They'd carved a space in one corner by stacking boxes full of clothes and bags up to the ceiling to make room for their delivery. They carefully unstacked the crates, laying them upright in the narrow space. The door at the opposite end of the room opened, and a small, mousy woman with large teeth poked her head in. "You're back." She sounded breathless, as if she'd just run a marathon. Thank goodness. There are at least 8 people waiting to be rung up, and the crazy lady's back. That's the last thing we need today, Jody thought, smothering a groan. I'm going to get the rest of the boxes off the truck. Earl's voice sounded uncharacteristically bright. Better not keep the driver waiting. I'll help you. Miho took hold of the trolley's handle and pushed it towards the door, which Earl held open, their fight forgotten in their mutual desire to escape the storefront. Allie, her eyes huge and pleading, hovered in the doorway. Jody shrugged at her. Guess it's just you and me. I'll take the crazy lady. Thank you, Allie breathed, and darted back into the store. Before following her coworker, Jody glanced at the crates, which stood just over head height once they were upright. Tall and imposing, the boxes looked even more like coffins than they had on the truck. Their bare, cheap wood took on a strangely gloomy tone in the harsh lights of the storeroom. Movement caught Jody's eyes, and she started as one of the crates near the back rocked slightly then stilled. Probably something in it was settling. Jody hesitated for another moment, her hand on the doorknob, worried that the rocking crate was a sign that they might topple. They held firm, though, stacked like impractically tall dominoes, sending thick shadows running up the walls behind them. Allie called her name, the girl's voice tense with stress under her thin veneer of polite friendliness, and Jody let herself through the door. I'm afraid not, she said for what felt like the 100th time. She leaned on the store's counter, holding a bag of clothing in front of her. To her right, Allie swiped clothes across the barcode scanner, checking out customers as quickly as she could. Her spiel was the same every time, found everything all right. Do you have a rewards account? Cash or card? Would you like a bag for that? Mrs. Danvers, their crazy lady, stood in front of Jody. Her small eyes were watery, their irises so dark that they looked like little pits of coal in her face. She kept licking her lips as though it were a compulsion, while she repeatedly nudged the bag towards Jody. There was something strange about her voice, and Jody glanced at her. The younger girl had backed away from the mannequin almost as soon as she'd set it upright. Hands crossed over her chest, she chewed on the ends of her hair. She only does that when she's anxious. Does she feel it, too? Jody sucked in her breath. She wanted to take a break, go outside, and sit for a while where it was quiet and less claustrophobic, but they had another 7 cartons to open before the end of Miho's and Allie's shifts. Let's get a move on. Earl, take that box out to the bins. Miho, where'd you put the crowbar? Jody opened the rest of the boxes quickly, almost recklessly. Her desire to escape the storage room outweighed her anxiety about breaking one of the ceramic statues. The team unceremoniously shoved the mannequins into the corner one by one, and Earl carried each box out after it had been emptied, gradually freeing up room. By the time she was done, Jody was panting, and her torso was covered in sweat. She threw the crowbar onto an open box of clothes and faced the store's newest acquisitions. The 8 mannequins, 2 male, 6 female, faced her with identical, inscrutable expressions. Their long white arms were outstretched, their stiff fingers angled into strange gestures. The light shone off their perfectly smooth skin, and Jody thought back to what Miho had said about them being unusually clean for secondhand. They were more than clean, they were flawless. Jody would have expected them to have sustained at least some damage at their old store, but she couldn't see a single scratch, chip, or crack. She didn't like the way it made her feel. She checked her watch. Allie and Miho would be off shift in 5 minutes. Better get them into the store and throw some clothes on them before you go. Jody approached the nearest one, a woman, and hooked her arms around the mannequin's chest. It was much heavier than she would have expected, and she strained to lift it and carry it towards the door. She eased her way into the front of the store, then dragged the mannequin to a corner of the room to stand it next to one of their old dummies. The replacement mannequins were long overdue. The old figures, which had been third-hand when Mr. Heinlein bought them, dated back to the 60s and showed their age. They were scratched, chipped, and grimy around their joints. 2 of them had limbs stuck on with duct tape. Jody had, after months of gentle nagging, convinced the boss to invest in new ones. She glanced between the 2 figures. One was horribly dirty, missing 2 fingers and nearly a third of the white paint on its face. Its torso was a little too large to hold the clothes well. The other looked brand new, immaculate, and perfectly formed. Still, Jody suddenly wished they could keep the old ones. She stripped the clothes off the old mannequin and pulled them onto the new figure. She hated the feel of its ceramic skin, and moved as quickly as she could. When she was done, she dragged the old dummy into the storage room, where their Miho and Earl had already finished too. Jody picked up another of the new mannequins and pulled it back into the storefront, aiming for the display windows. A middle-aged woman with short hair, one of their regulars, was riffling through a rack of discounted clothes. She smiled at Jody as she passed. "Finally got some new models, eh?" "Yeah," Jody panted, trying to smile despite the crawling feeling covering her arms and back. "About time, huh? They'll certainly brighten the store a bit." The woman moved away from rack of clothes to watch Jody set up the mannequin, and the expression on her face changed as she got a good look at the statue. Jody was halfway through pulling the old mannequin's sweater off when she glanced at the woman. Her face had changed from bright warmth to confusion, and as Jody watched, it morphed into concern. "Everything okay?" Jody asked, pulling the sweater free. The woman had turned her head to the side to watch the mannequin out of the corners of her eyes and, at Jody's voice, started. "Oh, yes, thanks. I'm supposed to meet my husband in the food court. I'd better go. Don't want to be late." "Sure." Jody, nonplussed, watched the woman leave the store with long, fast strides, disappearing amongst the milling shoppers in seconds. She turned to look at the mannequin, again feeling the unnerving sensation of being watched. She frowned and threw the sweater over the flawless white head. "Seriously?" Earl jolted and moved to hide the bottle, but Jody stalked around the desk to where he was crouched and snatched it from him. "Tubby wine, huh? What? Doesn't this job pay enough for a decent brand?" "Give that back," Earl snarled, getting to his feet, his face twisted in frustration. "It's nearly the end of shift anyway, so you thought you'd get a head start on tonight's plaster session?" Furious, Jody shoved the bottle back into his hand. "Nah. Not on my watch. I'm not working with a drunk." She was aware her voice had that hypercritical edge again, but she couldn't stop. The afternoon shift, despite being unusually quiet, had exhausted her more than the weekends did. It was the mannequins. She kept turning, sure that someone was in the store, watching her, only to find herself facing one of the statues. "You're just not used to them," she kept telling herself. "In a week, they'll be so familiar that they won't bother you anymore." "Have you even swept the floor?" "Sure I did." Earl had adopted the sulking, saggy expression she'd come to loathe. He raised the bottle to his lips and took a drink, glaring at her with his small, dark eyes. Jody breathed deeply through her nose, trying to quash the anger that threatened to spill out. "You could have fooled me. The floor's filthy." Earl shrugged and screwed the bottle's cap back on. It was just past their 5:30 closing time. Jody glanced about the store, taking a quick assessment of what still needed to be done. The floor needed sweeping, that was Earl's job. The bin behind the desk was overflowing with unwanted customer receipts and price tags, also Earl's job. Stock needed to come out of the back room to fill up the empty slots on the racks, 2 laybys needed filing in the back room, and the security system had to be set on the way out. Earl. The only completed tasks were hers. Jody, aware that she was seconds away from slapping her coworker, pulled her gloves on with harsh tugs. "Okay, I'm going home. You can close up on your own tonight." Ass. Earl called her a very unflattering name in response, but Jody pretended not to hear him as she stalked to the shutter on the front entrance and raised it just enough to slip underneath. A dozen stragglers were still meandering through the center, either on their way to their cars or waiting for a movie. She could hear shutters closing a little way off as another employee locked the doors to a nearby store. Turning left, towards the nearest exit, Jody walked as quickly as she could, glad to be out of the store for the day. And not just because of Earl. Miho was waiting for Jody outside the shop the following day, yawning and huddled in her jacket. Jody's morning had been filled with disaster, from lost car keys to catching every red light between her house and the shops, and her shift should have started 10 minutes before. "Sorry I'm late," she said, hurrying to find the store's key in her overfull keyring. "Everything's fine," Miho mumbled, shifting from foot to foot, either to keep warm or stay awake. "I forgot my keys at home." Jody pushed the key into the shutter's lock and frowned. The lock didn't turn like it normally did. She pulled on the shutters and swore as they rose without resistance. "What's wrong? Earl didn't lock the doors last night." Jody pushed them up, locked them into the slot in the roof, then swore again when she saw the inside of the store. Earl's now empty bottle still sat on the counter. The broom was propped against the jeweller's stand, though the floor hadn't been swept, and bundles of clothes had been draped across the store's racks. Worse, the mannequins had been stripped of their clothes, which lay in clumps on the floor. "Unbelievable," Jody hissed, stalking into the store. "He's going to get an earful this afternoon." She started snatching the clothes off the dirty floor and pulling them back onto the mannequins. Miho picked up the empty bottle and frowned at the label, chewing the ends of her hair again. "Do you think he has a problem?" "Oh, he's got a problem, all right. And its name is Jody." Miho laughed, and Jody felt herself relax. She liked working with Miho. The girl was quiet and unpresumptuous, and she worked hard. "Unlike some people I know." "Quick, throw that bottle away so the customers don't see." Jody began redressing the mannequins Earl had stripped while Miho tossed the bottle into the storage room and gave the dirtiest parts of the floor a quick sweep. The shopping center was filling up as the stores opened, and their first customer came in just as Jody shoved a cap onto one of the male mannequins' heads in a failed effort to make it look less sinister. The woman flicked through a rack near the door for a few seconds before drifting out without buying anything. 3 more customers quickly replaced her, then left again in under a minute. As Jody hurried through her morning tasks, she noticed more and more customers were entering the store then leaving almost immediately. Casual browsers weren't uncommon, but at least a few would always stay for a while and try on some of the clothes. It was so unusual that Jody found herself counting how many seconds each of the shoppers lingered. A regular customer stopped at one of the discount racks. The woman flipped through the shirts, then started as though something had alarmed her. She swung to face the mannequin behind her and stared at it for a moment before hurriedly pushing the shirt she'd been holding back onto the rack. Her aim was off, and the hanger and shirt clattered to the floor, but she didn't stop to pick it up as she pulled her jacket about herself and strode out the door. "Did you see that?" Jody asked, but Miho, who had been arranging the shoes on the shelf beside the desk, only looked at her questioningly. Feeling uneasy, Jody approached the discount rack. She faced the mannequin and searched its blank, soulless face, trying to find what had disturbed the customer. The statue only gazed back, expressionless, inscrutable. Jody turned and picked the dropped shirt off the floor. "Of course, it's in the one place Miho didn't sweep." She grimaced, trying to brush the dust and bits of fluff off the fabric, then froze. The strangest sensation came over her, the same one she'd felt in the truck, when she'd hesitated over the coffins, the crates. It also came over her very late at night or in the early hours of the morning, when she was walking home and couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed through the empty streets. She would put her hands in her pockets and quicken her step. Jody was never brave enough to glance into the dark alleys that ran between the buildings like empty veins, though she would swear she heard a second step masked by the echo of her own hurrying feet. She turned slowly, not wanting to see what was behind her, but too frightened to do otherwise. The mannequin stood where she'd left it, its face wearing the same empty expression, its hands still raised in odd gestures. It seemed different, somehow. More aware. Awake. Stop it. Stop it, stop it, stop it. Jody. Miho called from behind the desk. Something wrong. The customers felt it, too, Jody realized, staring at the mannequin and feeling, with overwhelming certainty, that it was staring back. Then laughter, raucous and mocking, shocked her, and she was finally able to break the gaze. A gaggle of teenagers had gathered in the maleware corner of the store, where they were yelling and pushing each other. "No, really, dude," a scrawny and pale one said, his loud voice easily carrying across the store. He was shifting in agitation, hopping from foot to foot and shaking his arms to make his duster flap. It blinked. "Dude," his companion said, stretching out the syllable and leaning on the nearest rack for support as he struggled to stop laughing. "It doesn't even have eyes." "Just how high are you?" Jody approached them without being aware that her feet were moving. Her mouth was dry and had an odd taste, and tension spread across her shoulders. "Can I help you?" The teenagers looked at her and laughed. "Nah," the tallest one said, slapping his pale companion on the back. "We're going." Jody felt frozen to the ground as she watched the teens leave with the peculiar loping gait that their social circle always seemed to favor. The pale one started laughing along with his companions as they mocked him. Slowly, Jody turned to look at the mannequin they'd been standing beside. It was the one she'd thrown a cap on. The cap had only succeeded in darkening the shadows under its eyes, once again giving her the sensation that it was watching her through the shrouded depths. "I'm taking a break," Jody said, crossing the store so quickly that she knocked several clothing racks askew. "Be back soon." Without giving Miho a chance to answer, she jogged into the storeroom and closed the door behind herself. Her hands were shaking, and the tightness over her shoulders had spread down her chest and knotted in her stomach like a cold, thick snake coiled in her abdomen. The storage room felt comforting, though. Its haphazard stacks of boxes overflowing with clothes, the shelves crammed full of laybys, and even the garbage bag left by the door were mundane, safe, and familiar. Jody sank to the floor and pulled her knees up under her chin, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. Her heart rate slowed, and strength gradually eased back into her limbs. "What's gotten into me?" She listened to the muted noises coming from behind the door that led to the main part of the store. "They're only mannequins." "Yeah, they're creepy, but they're not actually doing anything. Except for maybe bankrupting the store." Calm washed over her as the tension left her shoulders and the sweat dried. She thought of Earl, who would be coming in for his shift that afternoon. She hoped he wouldn't give Allie any trouble. If he tried to drink during work again, she would have to tell the boss, and she wasn't looking forward to it. Earl's father was surly, and although he wasn't fond of his son in any sense of the word, he hated criticism. Maybe I could move on. I might need to, anyway, if the mannequins are scaring the customers away. I could start putting out resumes again. Maybe actually make it into the journalism field and get some use out of my degree. Wouldn't that be amazing? I could get out of this awful store and away from Earl and Earl's father and the new mannequins. The door creaked open, and Miho's round face peered through. "Jody. You okay?" "Yeah, fine." Jody found her words were almost true. "Need help out front?" The crazy lady came in, Miho said. Jody sighed and got to her feet. Sure, I'll take her, but she left again. What? Jody went to the door and looked out. The store was completely empty. Miho shrugged, chewing on her hair. She stood by the discount rack for a minute then left. Didn't even try to talk to me. Huh. Jody looked towards the rack and a tall mannequin fitted out in slacks and a hoodie that stood beside it. She could guess why Mrs. Danvers hadn't lingered. Maybe those mannequins have some perks, after all. Jody sat behind the desk, tapping a pen on the scratched wooden surface as she surveyed the empty store. Calling it a slow day would have been an understatement. She'd kept herself busy dusting shelves and rearranging clothing racks, but without any customers, there was nothing else to do. Miho had gone home, and Allie, whose shift had started 10 minutes previously, was drifting amongst the racks, looking lost. And it's been like this all day, she asked on her third lap around the store. Pretty much. One woman came in to exchange her shirt for a different size. Otherwise, nothing. Maybe it's the weather. The rain from the previous day had continued through the morning as a drizzle, but Jody doubted that was to blame for their deserted store. Maybe. She checked her watch. It was 10 minutes past the end of her shift, but Jody was waiting for Earl. She'd spent the morning rehearsing what she wanted to say to him, in a calm, moderate voice, she promised herself, but he was, predictably, late. He must know I'm angry about the state he left the store in last night. He's probably hoping he can wait long enough for me to leave, and avoid the lecture. This is ridiculous, Jody grumbled. She picked up the desk phone and dialed the mobile number written on a post-it note hidden just out of the customer's sight. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. She hung up without leaving a message. He's not answering. Maybe he's driving here right now, Allie said, shaking out the top shirt on its stack and refolding it. Maybe, Jody said. Earl couldn't afford a car, and his father refused to lend him the family vehicle, so he took public transport on days he couldn't get a lift. A customer drifted in through the doors then floated out like a leaf caught in a swirl of wind. Her large teeth worrying at her lower lip, Allie watched the woman go. Well, you might as well head home. Even if Earl doesn't come in, it's not like I'm going to be overwhelmed. Jody pursed her lips. She hated the idea of letting Earl win, but his stalling tactics were gradually eating away at her afternoon off. She'd already made plans that involved the 3 latest episodes of her favorite show, an extra-large doner, and Chinese takeaway. Thanks, Al, I might do that. Look, Earl was acting up last night. I caught him drinking behind the desk, and he left the store unlocked. If he gives you any sort of trouble today, give me a call, all right? Will do. Just before 9 in the morning, the clouds from the previous 2 days had parted to offer a little weak spring sun. The weather forecast had said another storm was coming that evening, though, but Jody had been thinking there might be just enough time to dry the laundry before her shift that afternoon. She was nearly done when a bright jingle disturbed the silence and sent Jody searching her pockets for the phone. She glanced at the number and recognized the work landline. Who's scheduled this morning? It's Miho and Earl, isn't it? Or maybe someone else is calling. The sensation of something being not quite right was so strong and so sudden that it knocked the breath out of her lungs. The morning didn't seem bright anymore, but cold and alien. In her mind's eye, she saw a hand reach for the clothing store's phone on worn wooden bench, pick up the receiver, and dial her number. But the hand wasn't flesh and blood. The perfectly white porcelain fingers that should have been frozen moved dexterously as they danced over the number pad. Then the phone rang again, and Jody shook herself out of the stupor. The work number still flashed on the screen, and she pressed the answer button. Hello. Jody, thank goodness. The notes of fear and anxiety in Miho's voice doused Jody's momentary relief. What's wrong? She dropped a wet shirt into the washing basket. Miho hiccuped, then took a steadying breath. I think we've been robbed. What? Jody was already jogging into her house to find her car keys. Are you sure? Pretty sure. Jody pictured Miho standing behind the counter, holding the phone's old-fashioned receiver in both hands as she surveyed the store. The doors weren't locked again. And there's stuff everywhere, pulled off shelves, off racks. It's a disaster. Hang tight. I'm on my way. Jody hung up as she slid into the driver's seat of her car and turned the key in the ignition. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. The doors were unlocked, only 5 people had keys to the store: Jody, Allie, Miho, Earl, and Mr. Heinlein. Allie and Earl had been on closing shift the night before. Her first thought was that Earl had gotten drunk again and left the doors open, but she'd warned Allie about it the previous afternoon. Allie was too much of a worrier to let Earl close up shop alone, anyway. Geez, she hissed, weaving through traffic a little too quickly to be safe. She tried to think about how much might have been lost. It was a low-price store, and their most expensive pieces cost $60, so a thief couldn't have made off with a fortune. Mr. Heinlein would be furious, though, no matter how small the loss was. Jody parked haphazardly and jogged through the near-empty center. Miho was waiting just inside the store, and one look at the girl's face told Jody the last 10 minutes had been hell. Hey, it's okay. She put an arm around Miho's shoulders and gave them a squeeze. You're not hurt, are you? Miho shook her head, but her face was still scrunched up. The store, look at it, Mr. Heinlein, it's not your fault. He won't get angry with you. Jody gave the girl's shoulders another squeeze, then stepped forward to survey the damage. Miho hadn't been exaggerating, it was a disaster. Virtually every shelf was empty. The shirts, the jeans, the dresses, the jewelry, the skirts, and the shoes all lay in piles about the floor. A few items hung from the top of the shelves, and one scarf dangled from a ceiling light. Most of the clothing racks had been overturned, and the t-shirt table had been jammed into the corner. Most of the mannequins had been knocked over. It hadn't been casual riffling, it had been pillaging. I didn't touch anything, Miho said, watching Jody, who was turning in a slow circle to examine the room. Despite the gravity of the situation, or perhaps because of it, Jody had to bite down on a laugh. She could imagine Miho saying exactly the same thing to a pair of police officers at the scene of a violent murder. Okay. Jody pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose as she thought through their options. Close the doors, Miho. We can't let customers into the store like this. I'll call Allie. She gingerly stepped over the sea of discarded clothes to get to the checkout table while Miho pulled down and locked the shutters. Customers would still be able to see through the windows, and, in fact, a couple of curious faces were already peering through the empty display at the other end of the store, but at least they wouldn't be interrupted while they assessed the damage. Jody dialed Allie's number from the post-it note, then shifted from foot to foot as she waited. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Jody pressed on the switch hook and tried again, with the same result. She sighed and waited for the beep. Allie, call work, please. It's urgent. Next, she tried Earl's number. Again, her call went to voicemail. She didn't bother leaving a message. It was 9:15, which meant he was probably skipping work, again. Finally, she called Mr. Heinlein's number and scowled when his phone, too, rang out. No answering machine took the call. Miho was hovering beside the desk, chewing at the ends of her hair. Jody gave her a helpless shrug. Well, we did a stocktake last week, at least. That'll help us figure out what we're missing. Better get started. The cleanup consumed the entire morning. Jody stood at the desk, comparing sales receipts with their stocktake to come to an approximate tally of what they were supposed to have, while Miho picked the clothes off the floor, checked them for damage, and rehung them. Once Jody's list was complete, she joined Miho. Her back ached by the time they stopped for lunch. "We're getting there, at least," Miho said from her perch on the corner of the desk, eating the kebab Jody had treated her to. They'd rehung almost all of the scattered clothes but hadn't counted them yet. Jody checked her watch. "It's nearly the end of your shift. Do you want to go home? I doubt we'll be able to open today, anyway." Miho shook her head quickly, and strands of her sleek black hair stuck to the grease around her mouth. She rubbed them away with a grimace. "Nah, I'll stay and help out here, at least until Allie comes in." Jody was anxious for Allie's shift to start, too. The 5 calls she'd placed throughout the morning had all ended up in voicemail, and they still hadn't been returned. If she could just speak to Allie, she would at least know who was responsible for the damage. Allie or Earl might have dropped their key somewhere, giving a thief easy access to the store, or Earl had possibly gotten plastered and invited some of his buddies in to help him pull apart the shop he hated. Jody tossed her own kebab wrapper into the bin and hopped off the corner of the bench. The mannequin still needed writing, she's been putting it off, but with the rest of the store mostly sorted, she couldn't ignore them for long. They'd been stripped, just like the night before, and Jody picked up the first one gingerly. The white face stared down at her as she righted it. Even after being thrown to the ground, the porcelain was blemish-free. Jody found herself staring at it, searching the skin for imperfections, a hairline crack, a smudge, anything to abolish the niggling idea that the statues couldn't be damaged, but as her eyes darted over the face, she felt as though she were being scrutinized in return. In that moment, she became convinced that the lips weren't set in a neutral expression but that they were smirking. The face wasn't blank, it was arrogant and intense. She swiveled the mannequin away so it faced the opposite direction and dressed it as quickly as she could manage with shaking fingers. Jody knelt on the cold tiles, shaking out the tangled necklaces and bracelets that had been knocked off the jeweller's stand. Every 30 seconds, she paused to check her watch, then glanced at the shutter doors before frowning and returning to the jewelry. 2 minutes past the start of Allie's shift, she still hadn't arrived. Allie was notoriously punctual. Everyone else, including Jody, occasionally missed the start of a shift, except for Allie. She sometimes arrived as much as half an hour early if she'd heard traffic was likely to be bad. A tight ball of anxiety began to build inside Jody's chest. What if scenarios fluttered through her head, and they became increasingly difficult to push aside? What if, instead of being busy, she'd been unable to answer her phone? What if the break-in had happened while Allie was still in the store? What if she was in trouble, hurt, or worse? Jody's fingers faltered as she tried to prise apart a necklace and a watch, then she threw them onto the floor in frustration. Since Mr. Heinlein hadn't answered her first call that morning, she'd been reluctant to call again, partly because he tended to shoot the messenger and partly because she'd been hoping to finish the inventory and have exact details for him before delivering the bad news. But Mr. Heinlein held the contact details for Allie's family, and he was Jody's only other link to Earl, who might be able to shed light on what had happened the night before. One hand on the receiver, she hovered behind the desk, breathing deeply and wishing Allie would just turn up so she could delay the call for another few hours. The eyes were on her again. It seemed like every mannequin in the store had a direct line of sight to her. Their attention was fixed on her movements, the way the lump in her throat made her grimace when she swallowed, and how her eyes couldn't stay still. They were anonymous spectators, faintly amused, and she was their entertainment for the afternoon, a dull little distraction for them to judge at their leisure. Jody squeezed her eyes closed, trying to block out the faces and struggling to clear her head. She took a sharp breath, then bent over the bench to obscure the mannequin's view. Jody dialed Mr. Heinlein's number. He answered after 2 rings with his characteristic, "What?" Based on the way he slurred the word, Jody thought he must have had a cigarette in his mouth. Either that or he's drunk. She braced herself and described the situation as briefly and factually as she could. She tuned out a lot of what he said after that. He uttered copious swear words, most of them directed at her, and vague threats of suing for negligence. He also asked a series of questions she had no way of answering. How much is this going to cost me? And, who's responsible? Who the hell did it? Jody stared at her watch through the ordeal, letting her attention focus to the beautifully predictable second hand twitching its way around the dial. It was 8.5 minutes past by the time Mr. Heinlein's anger had ebbed enough for her to move the conversation along. Allie's shift was meant to start 10 minutes ago, but she's not here. Has Earl said anything about, haven't talked to Earl, Mr. Heinlein spat, sounding disgusted. Not for a couple days. We had an altercation, so he's gone to sulk at one of his idiot friend's house. That would explain why he hadn't been to work. It might also have been his motive for destroying the store, if he really was responsible. Well, I can't contact Allie. I'm worried something's happened to her. Maybe she's run off with my son, Mr. Heinlein said, and Jody cringed as his cold laughter broke into a hacking cough. The police should be contacted. Jody grimaced, knowing Mr. Heinlein had a deep-seated hatred for their local police. What the hell for? You want to cause trouble for the store? Is that what you're doing? She could feel the mannequins' amusement. They were gloating, mocking her for turning to such an unstable ally. Jody turned her back to them, facing the wall behind the counter, where a giant poster of a woman wearing fashions nearly 5 years old was stuck. Every time Mr. Heinlein tried to divert the argument, Jody repeated, Allie's missing. Someone should be contacted. It became a mantra, which she interjected any time her boss paused to take breath. I've turned into Mrs. Danvers. Hysterical laughter rose inside her, forcing her to bite her cheek to keep it contained. Fine, he snarled after she'd said the phrase for the 5th time. I'll call her family, and if they haven't seen her, I'll tell the police, and they'll probably shut the entire store down for a month while they figure out she skipped town with a drug addict boyfriend. Happy? Now get my store fixed. He slammed his receiver down, and the crack echoed in Jody's ears long after she'd replaced her own receiver on the cradle. She turned back to face the store, and the mannequins, and forced a ghastly smile onto her face for Miho's benefit as she returned to the jewelry rack. At nearly 4 in the afternoon, they finally finished the inventory. Jody ran through the numbers one last time, incredulous. The stock left in the store perfectly matched the list of what they were supposed to have. If there'd been a break-in, the thief must have spent upwards of an hour tearing the place apart, then left without taking so much as a bangle. That's good, isn't it? Miho leaned on the desk, looking drained. There were dark circles under her eyes, and the ends of her hair were split from her chewing on them. Jody gave her a sympathetic smile. I guess it is. Head on home. I'll call Mr. Heinlein, then close the shop early. We can reopen properly in the morning. She hesitated. I know tomorrow was meant to be your day off, but... Yeah, of course I'll come in. Miho sounded bright, despite her exhaustion. None of my classes this week are really important, anyway. Thanks. Keeping the store open with both Allie and Earl gone would mean a lot of extra work, and Jody hated the idea of having to spend time alone with the mannequins. Even just having half a day of company would be a huge relief. Jody ushered Miho out under the shutter doors, then pulled them back into place. She glanced about the store, feeling the solitude acutely, and tugged her jacket around her body as she made for the phone beside the desk. Mr. Heinlein answered almost immediately. Not only had he calmed down since the first call, but the news that his stock was intact actually made him cheerful. Good thing, too, he grunted. Can't afford to buy in anything else until the start of the new season. They cost us a day of business, but we'll recover from that. Jody licked her lips. The mannequins were watching her again, their empty eyes fixed on her as she paced behind the desk. Did you get in touch with Allie's family? Yeah, a dead end. Her contact was her father, who died last year. And then you called the police, right? Mr. Heinlein's guilty silence stretched out, and Jody snapped, she's not answering her phone, and she missed her shift. She could be in serious trouble. Fine, he snarled, then ended the call before Jody could say another word. Jody threw the receiver onto the desk, disgusted and furious, and looked up at her audience of mannequins. What? She snapped at the rows of faces, then turned and half walked, half ran to the supply room and pulled the door closed so sharply that the thin wall shook. Frustration and fear for Allie collected inside of her, knotting into a painfully hot ball inside her chest. She pressed herself into an empty space between the shelves and an open box of defective sequin shirts and pressed her hands over her face. She hadn't needed to work a full day in the store for a long time, and the constant bending and stretching had set a dull ache in her lower back. The storage room was comforting and safe. She was warm, and the sequin shirts under her cheek were unexpectedly comfortable. The store waited for her beyond the storeroom door, filled with the impersonal mannequins, and instead of mustering her strength and returning to them, she let her eyes close. Just a moment's rest. Then we can go home. Jody started awake, heart racing, palms clammy. After a second, she realized she was still huddled in the corner of the storage room. Grimacing, she rubbed at the side of her face where the sequins had bitten into her skin. The store was completely silent. Something had disturbed her, though, and she struggled to remember what it was. Some sort of beep. She found the source after a moment. A mobile had been left on one of the shelves, propped against a box of bags bearing the store's logo, and the message icon was flashing. Its owner might have set it down for a moment while putting a coat on or readying a shoe, and forgotten it. Jody guessed whose phone it was and swiped it on to make sure. Sure enough, the background was a photo of Allie's cats. There were 8 messages. 5 would have been from her, the rest must have come from friends or relatives. That explained why the calls hadn't been returned, at least. And if Allie used her phone's calendar to keep track of when she was working, she might have easily forgotten that she'd been scheduled for the afternoon shift. The anxiety in Jody's chest eased slightly, and she replaced the phone and rubbed at her sore eyes. It was just after 7:30, which meant the only shops left open would be the grocery store at the end of the center and the movie theater in the food court. Jody pushed through the storeroom door and back into the main part of the shop. It was pitch dark. The only light came through the windows, from the shopping center's large ceiling lights, and they were at the wrong angle to reach far into the store. Jody hesitated. I left the store lights on, didn't I? After her call to Mr. Heinlein, she'd been too angry to do anything except storm into the storage room. Perhaps one of the security guards had passed by, thought the store was empty, and turned the lights off for her. Impossible. They wouldn't have a key to get inside. Except, she hadn't locked the door after letting Miho out. Jody hurried through the store, weaving past the racks and tables that were only barely visible, to reach the shutters. She gave them a tug, but they held fast. Whoever had turned off the lights must have had a key, then, to lock the door. Did Miho come back? Allie, possibly, or even Earl. Jody turned to squint at the room. The 10 mannequins, barely visible shadowy figures, were spaced around like sentinels, some half hidden behind their racks, others posed on their stands by the windows. Wait, 10. Jody recounted them quickly, and her heart rate shot up. There were definitely 10 figures in the store. And yet, they'd only received 8 crates. Her mouth was suddenly dry. She moved quickly and quietly, not daring to take her eyes off the room that suddenly felt claustrophobic, as she sidestepped towards the light switch by the door. Her foot landed on something soft, and she hopped back, horrified. It was a t-shirt, casually discarded. Did we miss one of the shirts when we cleaned the place? No, we couldn't have. We were too thorough. Jody reached out a hand and fumbled for the switch beside the doors. It turned on with a quiet click, and light filled the room. Any thought of two of the shadowy figures being intruders disappeared with the darkness. They were all mannequins, their flawlessly smooth faces turned in her direction. Shaking and struggling to breathe, Jody counted them again. 10. 2 more than had arrived in the back of the truck. 2 more than the coffins she'd wrenched open. 10. How is that possible? It's a prank. Her eyes danced about the store, skimming over the figures. It's Earl's doing, I'll bet. He knew I was scared of them. He saw my face when we were unpacking them and the first mannequin fell on me. He was angry because I made him close up himself and because I complained about the alcohol. And he said the mannequins were cheap. He must have been able to buy 2 more of them and bring them in, when? Tonight? No, I would have heard. It must have been last night. And he destroyed the store while he was here to add atmosphere. And then he came back tonight to lock me in. The mannequins were naked again, Jody realized. Their clothes lay scattered across the floor. That accounted for the shirt she'd stepped on. The one thing she couldn't understand, though, is why someone would bother undressing all 10 dummies, and how she hadn't heard it. Very funny, Earl, she called, trying to sound braver than she felt. Your dad's mad at you, by the way. Silence. Chills crawled up Jody's arms, setting the hairs to stand on end. Earl had both the motive and the ability to set up the prank, but the more she thought about it, the less certain she was that he was responsible. It wasn't Earl's style at all. It was too subtle and nuanced, too clever. Earl would have been just as happy to throw a dozen eggs at her car. He's got to be working with someone, then. A friend? Are they building up to something? Should I get out before I get a metaphorical bucket of pig blood dropped on me? The store keys were in her bag under the front desk. Jody skirted the racks to get to it, not daring to take her eyes off the store. There were a dozen places a man could hide in that room without any effort, and being alone in the store while shoppers milled around just outside the windows was very different compared to the isolation once the shops were deserted. Jody ducked under the desk to pull her bag out from its shelf. She tugged open the front pouch where she kept her keys and licked at her dry lips as she found it empty. It's fine. I must have put it in a different pocket, that's all. Everything's okay. Straightening up, Jody surveyed the store again. It was still and quiet. And yet, something seemed wrong. The mannequins. She could have sworn they'd been facing the shutter doors a moment ago, but now they were looking towards the desk. Towards her. Jody swallowed thickly as she unzipped her bag and began digging through it. She'd been meaning to clean it out for months. The crumpled receipts, empty tissue packs, mouth fresheners, spare makeup, and hair brushes hindered her search. It was hard to focus while she felt so scrutinized. Desperate, Jody turned the bag upside down, scattering its contents across the desk, and searched for the metallic glint of her keyring. It wasn't there. Jody swore under her breath. Frustrated, she knelt behind the desk again, running her hand along the shelf in case the keys had fallen out. Nada. Damn it, Earl. Jody choked as she looked up into the dark glare of one of the mannequins. It had moved, impossibly, across the store to place itself on the other side of the desk, its hands spread and fingers resting lightly on the wooden surface. The head had turned to the side to regard her, and as Jody looked up at it, she found there was something terribly, horribly familiar about it. Earl's heavy brow, his small eyes, his slightly crooked nose, and his thin lips had been warped, changed, and reinterpreted into smooth ceramic and white gloss. The features were simultaneously familiar and hideously alien. Speechless, Jody backed away from him, trying and failing to understand what she was seeing. She turned to her left, where another of the mannequins stood beside the shelves of jeans. This one, too, was familiar. Allie's lips. Allie's jawline. Allie's high cheekbones. No, Jody whispered. No, no, impossible. There was a crack, and the lights died with a whine. Jody skidded away from the sound, and her back hit a rack of coats, sending them rocking as the store succumbed to darkness. She turned towards the windows that looked out into the shopping center. Those lights there were gone, too. What is this? A power outage? Lightning cracked across the sky. The harsh flash burst through the center's skylights and into the store. In that split second, she saw the mannequins had stepped off their stands and come out of their corners to inch closer to her. Earl's mannequin had reached out, its fingers extended towards her face. Then the light faded, and darkness rushed back in to take its place. Terror made her legs give out, and Jody tumbled to the ground, panting and shivering, feeling as though she were about to be sick. She could hear them, she realized. Stiff joints creaked as they moved. The faint, sharp taps of ceramic feet on tile accompanied shifting noises as they brushed past the racks, disturbing the clothes. Think. Think. The store has a generator, doesn't it? Why hasn't it come on yet? Something cool and hard brushed across Jody's exposed neck, and she shrank back from it with a gasp. Her skin chilled where it had been touched, as though the ceramic had been frozen. The entire store felt colder than it should have, and her muscles were cramping in the chill. She couldn't see them, but she could picture them, moving languidly, confidently, knowing she was blind and trapped. The infernal tapping noise was coming closer, so close that they must be on top of her. Jody shrank down close to the ground and balled her hands into fists, even though she knew her flesh would be useless against rigid ceramic. A whirring noise shocked her, and she opened her eyes. While the lights in her own shop stayed cold, the main center lights flickered back to life. They couldn't illuminate her store completely, but it was enough, and Jody risked raising her head. She was surrounded. Hands extended towards her, faces leaned close, and bodies barred her path. But they'd frozen. It's the light. They can't move in the light. Cold radiated off their ceramic. Jody shrank as far from the grasping hands as she could, her mind scrambling for an escape. If she could just get outside the store and find a place with lights and other people. The shutter doors were locked, though, and the keys had been stolen. The store windows were reinforced to prevent breaking, and there was no other exit. Except, Jody's eyes landed on the door to the storeroom. If she could get through the back room and down the concrete hallways, she would be able to make it to the center court, where the movie theater would still be open, and that meant Light and company and safety. They're slow. She glanced back at the empty faces leering down at her. Surely I can outrun them. The light only penetrated into the first few feet of the store, though. From there to the back room was a mess of shadows. Go, Jody urged herself as desperation battled with fear that had frozen her to the ground. Go, before the lights go out again. Go, go. There was no way to push past the mannequins without touching them, so Jody pulled herself to her feet and threw herself over the top of the service desk, tumbling to the floor on the other side. Her weak legs held her, and she began running between the racks, dodging the clothes on the ground that the mannequins had shed. Her hand latched onto the handle of the stockroom door, and she twisted it, pausing just long enough to glance over her shoulder. The mannequins had turned their heads to watch her progress. Jody swore as she slipped through the door and pulled it shut behind her. Apparently, the generator didn't power the back sections of the shops, the storeroom was dark, and there was no sign of light coming from under the door leading to the concrete passageways. Jody fumbled in her pocket for her phone, but it was empty. Where? Of course, on the front desk, with everything else from my bag. Jody moved forward, feeling her way along the shelves, until she found the one she knew held the store's branded bags. The quiet squeal of a door being opened sent Jody's heart into her throat as she felt around the box's base, searching for Allie's phone, and a gasp escaped her as her fingers fixed on the cool metal. She swiped it on, and the weak light spread through the room, illuminating the high-stacked boxes, the labby bags, the piles of clothes, and the mannequin, standing just behind her. She backed away from it, keeping her light focused on its face. Its eyes followed her from inside the shadowed hollows below its brow. Jody reached her spare hand behind herself, feeling for the door that led to the hallways. Grasping the handle, she pulled it open. The concrete passageway spread to her left and her right. The right path would take her towards the grocery store at one end of the center. The left path led to the loading docks, the center court, and the movie theater. She turned the door's lock before closing it, hoping it might delay the mannequins for at least a moment, then she ran. The motion made it impossible to hold the light steady, and it flashed across the stained concrete floor and dark chipped walls in erratic bursts. Scraping, dragging, and creaking noises came from behind her. She tried shining the light over her shoulder, hoping that would slow them down, but she nearly tripped in the darkness. Doors on either side of her led into different stores. Most of them were locked, she knew, and the ones that weren't locked would lead her back to the quiet parts of the center. The noises were growing closer, becoming louder, echoing off the concrete and blending with the sound of her slapping feet. She didn't dare stop, but sucked breaths into her dry, sticky lungs as stress and exertion caused a stitch in her side. Not far now. Just the next left, a white shape loomed out of the darkness, filling the hallway she'd been aiming for, and Jody skidded backwards, gasping. Her hands shook almost too badly to hold the light on the mannequin that had taken one of the backways to block her path. The loading dock. Get outside, into the parking lot. Run for the center court. Jody turned, using her momentum to swing herself down the opposite hallway, towards the loading dock, towards the place her nightmare had started. A flash of lightning ahead told her the doors were open. Someone must be waiting for a delivery that night, and she raced for them, barely pausing to breathe. A new sound was building and pressing against her eardrums. Torrential rain pounded the asphalt as the storm spent itself over the center. As she leapt into the vast concrete room, another flash of lightning gave her a split-second view of the parking lot. She couldn't see a single car. The rain was coming at a sharp angle, heavy enough to obscure the trees grown by the ends of the parking rows. Litter, leaves, and even small branches that had been stripped off the trees whipped across the asphalt, gripped by terrific winds. Jody lowered her head as she dashed under the loading dock doorway. Icy rain stung her face, blinding her, clinging to her hair, and slipping down her neck. It drenched her in no time at all, and she struggled to keep up her speed with the wet clothes flapping around her and a stitch digging into her side. The center was shaped like a boomerang, with the parking lot nestled against the inside curve, and Jody could see the lights at the opposite end, with the movie theater and food courts, shining through the rain. Trying to block out the sensation that she wasn't running alone, she focused on the light, blinking furiously as the rain dripped into her eyes and plastered her hair across her face. She no longer tried to control the light from Allie's phone, but it flashed around her as she pumped her arms. For a split second, the light landed on a ghostly shape running abreast of her. Jody gasped and keened right, towards where a barrier of shrubs would divide her from the figure. She turned too sharply and skidded on a patch of oil left on the asphalt. Jody lost her balance as her legs slipped from under her. Then a white shape appeared out of nowhere, phasing through the rain, arms extended towards her. Unable to stop her momentum, she collided with the hard ceramic and tasted blood. The arms, colder than the rain, colder than ice, slipped around her in a dead man's embrace. Just like I caught it on that first day. She struggled to pull back and worm her way free, but the grip was like a vice, crushing the air out of her lungs. Jody raised her head as thunder purled overhead, the deafening noise sent vibrations through her body. The mannequin's ghastly white face stared down at her, inscrutable in the darkness as rain pinged off its glossy ceramic skin. More shapes were materializing behind it and to either side as the mannequins moved in, surrounding them. Jody opened her mouth to scream, and the mannequin pressed a long, frozen finger to her lips as it smiled down at her. Miho jogged through the shopping center, hands thrust into her jacket pockets as she tried to warm herself. She'd become drenched in the short run from her car to the center's doors. It was terrible weather, and the forecast didn't expect it to clear for another day or two. Their store's doors were still closed, and Miho allowed her jog to slow to a brisk walk. She was late for the morning shift, but, by the look of it, so was Jody. As she fished her keys out of her bag, Miho vaguely wondered if the other woman had woken up as sore as she had. The shutters slid up into their case with a scraping, grumbling noise. The inside of the store was intact that morning, thankfully, and Miho had settled into her space behind the counter before she realized Jody had taken the clothes of the mannequins. Why on earth? Jody clearly didn't like the dummies. After all that pressure she'd placed on Mr. Heinlein to buy them, she'd actually seemed quite paranoid since they'd arrived. So why'd she go to the trouble of stripping their clothes off? Miho began picking the items off the floor and redressing the mannequins. If she was being completely honest, she wasn't a huge fan of them either. They were always watching her, which was, of course, impossible. They didn't even have eyes. Miho knew that it was meant to be a sign of good art if a painting's eyes followed someone around the room. She wondered if the same principle applied to statues. She was slinging a sweater over one of the female mannequins when she sensed Jody standing behind her. Miho swung around, shocked and half laughing as she said, "Joe, you startled me. I didn't hear you come in." The words died on her tongue as she faced the figure behind her. It wasn't Jody, but another mannequin. The face looked remarkably like her friend's, though, almost as if it had been modeled off her. Miho leaned closer, frowning at it, wondering how she hadn't noticed the similarities before. Then something happened that Miho had no answer or explanation for. The mannequin blinked.